Hello everyone, it's Wednesday today, and Wednesday starts with W, W, and we're going to do W with our fingers. So M is that way up, and if we point up at the weather, we get W, W, and we'll do that by going down, up, down and up. We've got two pointy bits hanging down, W. And our story today is about Wendy the Wonky Worm. And we can do Wendy the Wonky Worm using W. So if we get our W shape like this and add a head on, she's a worm, wrinkly skin which helps her to get through the ground. That's it. So this is Wendy. Wendy the Wonky Worm. So Wendy the Wonky Worm lived in the garden behind the walls of a big old house called Wingleton Manor, and there was a wild wood outside the walls, and Wingleton Manor was owned by an old lady called Winifred, who spent all day wearing her Wellingtons in the garden, a bit like me. Winifred loved all the wildlife in her garden, but she was especially fond of her worms, and even the wonky ones like Wendy, because in the garden the worms do a very important job. You see, the worms worked in the garden, and their wormholes helped the water and the air to get to the roots and the soil. And their other job was to gobble down all the old garden rubbish, and thus they helped to keep the garden neat and tidy. And Winifred even had a wormery in her garden. That's a place where you have lots of worms together and you give them all your garden rubbish, and they eat the rubbish and they make fertiliser and compost. But Wendy the Wonky Worm was a bit of a wild worm. And outside there was a whole world that she'd never seen. She liked to explore. And so it was that one day Wendy the Wonky Worm wiggled and wriggled. Can you wriggle? Can you wriggle? See if you can wriggle. Wriggled her way across the moat and into the wild wood. At first, Wendy the Worm was excited. This world was so big, and there was lots of leaf mould for her to weave her worm magic on. But as the sun started to set and the wild wood cast its shadow across the ground, Wendy started to wonder whether she'd made a big mistake. So she did what worms do, and she dug a hole and wormed into the ground. However, Wendy hadn't realised that outside the wild wood there were all sorts of creatures who liked nothing more than to eat worms for their dinner. Personally, I don't like eating worms, but there you go. We all like different things. And as Wendy the Wonky Worm lay in her hole, she heard a snuffling sound. Can you do a snuffling sound? You know what it might be? You see? Suddenly, the giant jaws of a mole appeared and snapped at her in the darkness. Luckily, because moles don't have very good eyesight, and because Wendy was extra wonky than an ordinary worm, the bite missed, and Wendy quickly wormed her way up to the surface. And Wendy the worm started to wonder, had she made a big mistake? The next morning, Wendy awoke to find it was a bit rainy and her wonky wormhole was filling up with water. So she started to wriggle upwards, and just as she was about to poke her head through the surface, the big yellow beak of a blackbird poked through the ground and tried to eat her. But luckily, because the blackbird had a very straight bill like a triangle, and Wendy was a bit of a wonky worm, the beak missed, and Wendy quickly wormed herself away. Wendy, the wonky worm, started to wonder if she'd made a big mistake. Wendy managed to wiggle her way to the foot of a giant willow. And she sat there watching the wood, which now felt very wild indeed. And as she sat in the roots, Wendy. As she sat in the roots, wondering what she would do, she heard a snarling sound. And just at that moment, the snout of a hedgehog appeared round the side of the willow. Luckily, because the hedgehog got his prickles stuck on a root, and because Wendy was an extra wonky worm, its long tongue missed Wendy, and Wendy quickly wormed herself away. Wendy started to wonder if she'd made a big mistake. Just as she was starting to feel that she would never see her worm friends again, Wendy saw the familiar sight of Winifred's Wellingtons. Winifred had come to cut some willow to weave and make plant supports for the plants at the walled garden. And Wendy carefully climbed onto the Wellington boot and clung there and held on tight. Winifred walked very slowly, because she was quite old, back to the walled garden. And when Wendy saw that she was back inside and safe, she carefully wriggled off the Wellington and wriggled her way underground to have a well-earned sleep. And whilst she often thought about having another adventure, she decided that for her the walled garden was the most wonderful place for a wonky worm, and never again would she worm her way to the wild wood, but she would stay where she was safe and loved. And so she lived evermore in the walled garden, happily ever after. Right, so tomorrow I'm going to do some songs, and then on Friday I'm going to do the pirate song, I think. Okay? Right, see you tomorrow. Bye.